August 24th. Aero 300. It was high time that I used the schnorkel to ventilate the compartments. The process required us to run the diesels while sailing submerged, a novelty that had long intrigued me. The chief raised the boat to 14 metres, had the mast erected and drained, and the valves opened. With a long sigh, fresh air streamed into the sweating drum. One of the diesels began to mutter and draw more cool sea air into the hull. As the boat gained speed, she stabilised and floated rigidly through the depths. What a sensation! The impressive performance convinced me that the total U-boat had been born. There was no longer a need to risk extermination on surface. Life in a German diving tube had become bearable again. We charged our batteries and floated in secrecy through the eastern fringes of the enemy-infested Bay of Biscay. We stopped our engines and made our sound checks at irregular intervals, so that no pursuer could plot our course and intercept us with a deadly barrage. When a new day dawned, I suspended our submerged breathing exercise. Periscope and float were withdrawn, and U-953 balanced out at a depth of 40 metres. While the sun made its daily circle, U-953 continued blindly on her submerged run southeastward. This cruising without any navigational fix became a greater challenge the longer we stayed below surface. When midnight came again, we stuck our float and scope into the air. None of the aircraft patrolling the bay detected the head of the air mast or the tip of the scope, even though they flew low enough to graze the water. By dawn on August 26th, we had succeeded in reaching the southernmost point on our route. From here I had decided to make the run east for coast and port. 5 hours later, U-953 gently touched ground at a depth of 48 metres. I had her raised to periscope depth and discerned a thin line in the east, land. Searching the horizon carefully, I spied the mastheads and funnels of destroyers lurking in the north. We had circumvented the trap by chance. 13:20. The next time that the eye of the scope broke through the slimy surface, the coast stood like a wall ahead of us. We were overwhelmingly close, too close for safety. I acted fast to avoid being washed ashore. Hard left rudder, steer 340. Soon I could almost reach out and touch the slender lighthouse on the northern tip of her D'Oléron. A formation of 6 two-engined aircraft flew into view at low altitude. I downed the scope and let them pass. 3 minutes later I found the sky clean, took several bearings on the lighthouse, while Henneke, my navigator, did the plotting. We detected a strong northbound current, and I realised that I could not maintain the boat's position until nightfall, when I could risk surfacing and proceeding into port. I had the boat put aground in an area where some of my friends had been slaughtered only days before, stepped down into the eerie light of the control room, and studied the chart that contained all details of the coastal waters around the two islands. Hide Ray in the north, with the small town of St. Martin in its centre, had attained dubious fame. The ancient fortress dominating the landscape had been the intermediate station from which the French sent their hardened criminals and political prisoners to Devil's Island. 2 hours after sundown we surfaced. The lighthouse had disappeared. Assuming that the current had carried our boat northward, I headed into the current toward the tower in the south, running on quiet electric motors to avoid attracting the destroyer's attention or activating the acoustical mines. 7 minutes later, my binoculars picked up a tall, thin tower. I identified it as the lighthouse and sent a stream of information to my navigator, relying upon his skill to guide the boat through the waterway into the anchorage of La Rochelle. "It's time to turn east. New course 115, Henneke advised. "Left hard rudder. Steer 115, I ordered. As U-953 turned silently toward land, it looked as if we would sail straight into the ground. Suddenly a grinding and a light shock indicated that the boat had indeed hit ground. She slid into soft silt and came to an immediate stop. "Blow all tanks! All back emergency!" I screamed. The boat rose, and the wildly churning screws pulled her out of the mud and back into deeper water. Disregarding the destroyers, I ordered the depth finder turned on, found the groove in the narrow channel, and continued cautiously east, occasionally hitting ground. Something was positively wrong. The lighthouse gradually dissolved astern as we groped ahead for 4 hours, unable to spot any recognizable point, and I grew ever more suspicious as the bottom again came steadily closer to our keel. Then came the moment when there was simply no more clearance. After swinging the boat around in a circle and hitting ground several times, I conceded that we were trapped. At that moment day dawned and fog rolled in. I dropped anchor to ride it out until the sun burned off the white, fluffy mass. At 7:40 the fog settled, exposing the higher portions of the nearby coast. Then, abruptly, the blanket evaporated, and the land lay fully exposed. So were we. I weighed anchor in a hurry, and was comparing charts and handbook when an explosion rocked the air, barely 100 metres on port. The low bellow of a cannon followed. We were being attacked by our own artillery. "Challenge from land, sir. They request identification." "Give them our number by lamp, exec, and tell them to inform base that we will be in port by 23 hours. As I realised that I had sailed into the wrong bay, I ordered the chief to dive at once. U-953 settled with a light jolt in soft silt. A mere 3 metres of greyish sandy water covered the rim of the bridge, and high tide had just occurred. My promise to reach port before midnight was far too optimistic. It was now all too clear that I had mistaken the lighthouse on the northern end of Haie de Ray for the one on Haie d'Oléron. Since I had definitely identified the proper lighthouse the day before, I concluded that we had been dragged north by the strong current for the incredible distance of 17 miles, and had unknowingly passed the mine-infested entrance into port where 3 U-boats had been destroyed the previous week. Since all lighthouses look alike at night, I had had no reason to assume that I had taken my bearings from the wrong tower. Besides, the bay that I was trying to enter had physical features almost identical to those of the waterway leading into La Rochelle harbour. Now, riveted to scope, I was obliged to watch the water fall and wonder how long we would be permitted to live. Beyond the lighthouse, 3 British planes kept scanning the surface, while our bridge rose higher and higher out of the muddy lake. 2 hours after noon, the tide stopped falling, but I was so hypnotised by the arrogantly flying aircraft that I did not realise the water was rising until the bridge was fully swallowed by the bay. Then, vastly relieved, I dropped into the control room and played cards with the chief and a few mates until nightfall. 21:30. U-953 rose to surface, sped with thundering diesels out of the unfriendly bay, passed the lighthouse, raced 1/2 mile out to sea, turned south, and surged parallel to the shore of Haie de Ray toward port. We saw the shadows of the British destroyers following us, as if confused by our reckless self-exposure, and after an interminable hour of listening to shrill radar impulses, we reached the channel leading into La Rochelle. Then, halting our noisy diesels, I switched to silent electric drive. In a short time we spotted the silhouette of a small minesweeper sent out to our rescue. After we had answered her challenge, the vessel hurried back into port with her minesweeping gear rattling loudly. 6 acoustical mines detonated at various distances in an arc ahead of the trawler. The concussions drove our whole company out of the hull. At 02:30 on Monday, August 28th, U-953 finally glided into her berth in the concrete bunker in La Palisse. She was the only boat that had survived relocation from the northern ports. When my men passed through the centre aisle with their aromatic morning coffee, I shoved back the green curtain and turned on the light. Soon, refreshed by a strong brew, I left the boat to report my arrival to the commandant of the 3rd U-boat flotilla. I spotted only 2 U-boats, old submersibles, their conning towers battered and streaked with rust. Signs of desolation were apparent everywhere. Reaching the end of the cool, dark bunker, I stepped into the humid morning air. A short ride in a Citroën brought me into the ancient walled town of La Rochelle. The car stopped in front of a 3-story building, and armed sentries directed me to the commandant's office. A short, stocky officer, well over 15 years my senior, and wearing a washed-out khaki uniform, rose from his desk. "I've already heard of your arrival," said the commanding officer. "We are open all weekend. You didn't have to wait until today to enter port. You are lucky that our artillery understood your signal. They usually don't. They have orders to shoot at anything that approaches land. At first they thought you were a British submarine discharging saboteurs. You see, we are well prepared for a landing." "Do you think the assault is imminent, sir?" "Yes. They might very well try to penetrate from the seaside, but our guns will keep them away. We have some advantages over Brest and Lorient." He informed me briefly of the efforts the combined armed forces made to reinforce the city's defence. The German front along the Biscay coast was slowly falling back, and the naval defenders of La Rochelle expected a great influx of heavy artillery, tanks and infantrymen, which would relieve them of their unfamiliar land duties. The commanding officer urged me to send my supercargo, the extra men of ZJ 415 and the stowaway technicians, to the adjutant for immediate repatriation to Germany. All equipment wrenched from the Allied grip in Brest was to be loaded on trucks and shipped to ports at home. The commandant concluded, "Your boat must be ready for patrol by the weekend. 4 days in port is all I can allow you." "But, sir, I need more time than that. My batteries and the diesels should have been replaced months ago. I was told I would get new batteries here. That's why I made the trip in the first place." "You were misinformed," he said firmly. "We have no supply of any kind. I am sorry, but you will have to wait for replacements till you arrive in Norway." I swallowed my anger, saluted, and marched out. In 4 working days, we could not even make repairs essential to the boat's safety, much less prepare her for a long patrol. The short trip from Brest had already revealed countless deficiencies. They would grow rapidly more dangerous the longer they went unserviced. On my return to La Pallice, I instructed the 2 former officers of U-415 to disembark their crew and arrange for their return to Germany. Then I told my officers of U-953 about our blitzkrieg schedule. We soon discovered to our dismay that German shipyard personnel was already fleeing homeward to escape another approaching disaster. I therefore put all my machinists to work to get U-953 into fighting condition. At once, frantic activity sprang up along the pier and around the cubicle where our boat had found temporary refuge. The bulky cargo, which had hampered shipboard operations, was brought to daylight and loaded on trucks. The drivers fidgeted impatiently, eager to make their getaway to the east. The situation in port reflected the confusion which spread throughout the French countryside. The Allies, attacking in all directions with strong armoured columns, had made considerable progress during the days we had been at sea. In Brittany, American forces had overrun Nantes and were continuing along the coast with great speed. Paris had fallen into Allied hands on August 24th, to the joyous frenzy of the French population. Along the Côte d'Azur, the Allied invaders took Toulon and Marseille and terminated our losing struggle in southern France. Everywhere in German-held areas, teams of saboteurs in the French underground gained enormous strength. Supplied by Allied airdrops, they cut our communications and supply lines and harassed our escape routes through the French hinterland. Rails and highways were also the targets of Allied bombers, while fighter planes machine-gunned the long columns that streamed out of the western ports. Thousands of men untrained in land warfare. Civilians, technicians, garrison clerks, sailors, shipyard hands, supply workers, auto mechanics, could not fight back against ambush and air attack, and were slaughtered wholesale. Some columns were reduced to pitiful handfuls of refugees who hiked and foraged their way back to Germany. 25,000 men escaped La Rochelle and nearby ports during these days of general retreat in late August 1944. Among them were my former crewmen of U-415, along with hundreds of seamen from other U-boats which could not be made seaworthy. In Bordeaux, the crews of 1723, U-129, U-178 and U-188 had to blow up their veteran boats before they took to the roads. Their flight across a hostile France led those men through a hell of hardship and humiliation. Only a few reached the German border. The rest ended up dead in ditches or interned behind barbed wire fences. In La Rochelle, the U-boat tragedy lasted a little longer. One boat, U-260, sailed for Norway at the end of August. She was one of the few boats to succeed in breaking through the blockade, but she later was lost in a minefield near the southern coast of Ireland. With the departure of U-260, my boat was the only one remaining in the vast concrete structure which had housed well over 40 U-boats during the peak year of our power at sea. U-953 was also the last of our boats to lay in any French port. 66 U-boats had been destroyed since the day the invasion had begun, as against only 170,000 tons of enemy shipping sunk by use during that period. The Allied defence had been so effective that more than 3/4 of the Schnorkel boats sent out to attack the invasion convoys had not returned. During the crucial days of August, the British defences were expected to be weak along the convoy routes through the Irish Sea and the North Channel, but by then only a few boats survived to exploit the weakness. With the extermination of at least 90% of our operational fleet at sea, and with the foreclosure of all Biscay ports as U-boat bases, headquarters was forced to cease the U-boat war in the English Channel. The last act of the tragedy would be played out further north, and my boat lay stranded in La Rochelle. Realizing that France was irrevocably lost and that we had only a few days left to spend our last pay, I allowed my crew a 3-hour shopping spree in the downtown stores during a Saturday afternoon. My pockets were filled with francs, but I found little to buy and less that attracted my fancy. Finally, I surrendered my bundles of francs for a colourful housecoat for mother and silk stockings for my sister. At curfew, the crew returned promptly to their temporary quarters in town, for our safety at night could no longer be guaranteed. Just that morning, 2 half-dressed naval officers had been found dead in a side street gutter, throats slit and penises cut off. J7 953 was not in running order by our weekend deadline. My mechanics worked all of Sunday to complete the most important repairs, but it was not until Tuesday evening, September 5th, that the chief declared the boat ready for patrol, with certain restrictions and limitations. I scheduled our seagoing for Wednesday night. At 1000, September 6th, I entered the commandant's office, wearing my washed-out fatigues, to report Seventals 953, ready for sailing. Informally, he accepted my notice and wished me luck. He then disclosed that Senior Officer West, who was about to escape the siege by plane, had asked me to report to him. I wondered what Captain Rosing had to tell me. I had never quite understood his function, since the tactical deployment of U-boats was decided at Donitz's headquarters. I jumped into the waiting armoured car and raced through the city with screaming tyres. Minutes later, I arrived at a stately villa. Everywhere were signs of hasty departure. Marines were burning piles of documents on the lawn, loading cabinets and office machines on trucks. I was led to the senior's elegant room. Rosing, wearing snow-white trousers, finished packing tennis balls and rackets in a valise, then began speaking in his staccato manner. "Had time to leaf through your logbook. Noticed you managed well in shallow waters. Is that your specialty? You seem to have no difficulty breaking blockades." "Sir, it can be done," I answered, annoyed on 2 counts. First, it was he who had told us, back in May, to ram our boats into enemy ships. Then, too, the compliment meant little coming from a man who had only shortly been in command of a U-boat and probably had never heard a depth charge explode. He continued, "Well, we'll give you a hard nut to crack this time." He unfolded a map and headquarters plan for my patrol. I was to operate in the North Channel, in a dangerous area tucked between the northern Irish coast and the minefields west of Scotland. Detailed orders would follow by radio. He handed me some charts containing data on the minefields, advised me on how to avoid disaster at La Rochelle, how to circumnavigate the British blockade, and how to reach my operational area. Then he snapped, "Any more questions?" Since I had my own ideas on how to navigate, I simply said, "No questions, sir." Rosing's salute ended the peculiar meeting. I ran to the car and raced alongside armoured columns to the compound. I packed my meagre belongings and took the armoured car back to the bunker. En route, I saw a few heavy tanks rumbling by, and infantrymen and light artillery streaming through town to take up their field positions. From beyond came the low, rolling thunder of the approaching battle. In less than 1 week, La Rochelle had turned from a sleepy medieval town into a strong garrison determined to make a last-ditch stand. Reaching La Palisse, I paused at the entrance to the U-boat bunker and raised my face toward the sky and the sun. I savoured that moment, knowing that I would dive that night and live in obscurity for many weeks, that I would not see the sun again until I surfaced in a Norwegian fjord after an underwater voyage of some 2,000 miles, after summer had gone and fall or even winter would have arrived. Or I might never see daylight again and sink instead to my grave in eternal darkness. As I approached my boat, I was strangely startled by the wooden containers of fresh vegetables that stood on deck. For a moment it seemed as if nothing had changed since the days of glory when I began my service aboard U-boats. Of course, nothing was the same. Like our great land victories, our few hundred U-boats had all but vanished, but at least one would die fighting. My exec, who was overseeing the loading of the fresh food, came to my nod, and I told him of my decision. "We leave this trap 1 hour after midnight without an escort. Keep that to yourself. And no roll call either, please." "How about notifying the artillery, the coastal batteries?" "I don't want them to know that we sail. The Tommies have too many ears. I'll take the risk of being shot at." Then I lowered myself into my coffin. At 20:30, after dinner, the lights went out. I closed my curtain and stretched out on my green leather mattress. The lonely pressures of command gripped me like a cold fist. With the departure of U-953, with the sailing of our last U-boat from our last port along the Biscay shore, the battle in the Atlantic came to a bitter yet defiant finale. September 7th. 0100. I was studying the charts in the eerie light of the control room. My planning absorbed me so deeply that I was startled to hear the exec's low voice. "Boat is ready to leave port. Crew is on action stations." "Thanks. Have all watertight doors shut and all men put on their life preservers. Only 2 or 3 should be in the hull while we traverse the harbour." The watertight doors clicked and the crew slipped into their yellow inflatable jackets. I put on my lambskin coat, followed the last man to the bridge, and said quietly, "Let go bow and stern ropes. Both motors slow astern. Rudder amidships." The boat silently cleared the pier and glided, stern first, out of the concrete structure, 300 metres into a dark night. No one took notice of our escape. "Both stop. Both small ahead. Port 20. New course 280. I directed the boat into the centre of the Narrows between the 2 islands. For the last time I glanced at the shadowy city of La Rochelle, which would soon face the fate of Brest and the other ports under Allied siege. The sleek boat sailed noiselessly through the dark waters. The last of the wolves deserted his lair. It was a bitter pill to swallow, abandoning this shore from which we had carried our flag across the 7 seas. I felt as if all my previous patrols, all our great sacrifices, had been vain endeavours. As the faint strip of land receded and the bay overflowed into the ocean, the tide was at its highest. The lean tower of the lighthouse of Hadero-6 on port ahead showed us our way through the nightly haze. Shadows on starboard, destroyers, bearing 340. At that moment we were confronted by 6 enemy surface vessels, only vague images seaward. Yet there were no radar impulses. We remained undetected even by our own artillery. When we had the shadowy lighthouse on port 120 degrees, I changed course to due south. I proceeded noiselessly and slowly, using the black coastline as a cover. After the lighthouse had vanished, I risked switching to diesels. As the worn-out engines began to mutter and spout black exhaust fumes, U-953 gained speed. We sailed southward in close proximity to the shore for a distance of 10 miles, always prepared to be intercepted by the enemy. But, just as I had expected, the watchdogs slowly retreated before the first sign of a dawning day and the renewed threat of our coastal batteries. Then I turned the boat toward the open sea. When the stars were extinguished, U-953 withdrew from the surface. The Biscay shore would never see her again. After sundown on our second day at sea, a storm blew up. High winds swept heavy waves over our schnorkel float, cutting off the air supply every so often, creating a vacuum which took our breath away and made us feel as if our heads were exploding. Notwithstanding the raging storm, I felt comfortable. With the boat protected by 14 meters of water and by high waves, radar detection of the float and scope was almost impossible. It had been a long time since I had felt so secure, and the unpleasant side effects of the schnorkel routine were evened out by the relative ease with which we evaded the enemy aircraft. During those hours of clandestine activity and highest vigilance only a few meters below the lethal surface, our radio operators kept busy decoding signals from headquarters concerning U-953 and the few other wolves which were still afloat. In the stream of messages that reached me in the control room was a precise order for a new operation. I was to form a patrol line together with U-484, U-743, and U-925 along the western entrance to the North Channel. U-953 was to assume the southernmost position. After the regular transmission time for signals with tactical contents, headquarters flashed out the latest armed forces communiques. They told us of raging battles and of our serious losses in western and southern France. The British had made a spectacular advance into Belgium, and the Americans had reached a line from Namur to Orléans. We also heard that French-British forces were pressing north along the Rhône, and that the Soviets threatened to overrun our eastern provinces. More news, all bad, told about air attacks by huge bomber fleets which levelled our cities and turned them into incinerators. There was not a single encouraging sentence, not the faintest hint of a halt in the declining trend. On the night of September 10th, a cable fire in the control room brought us to the verge of disaster. Only the quick reaction of the chief, who extinguished the flames with his gloved hands, spared us an unscheduled ride on the surface, to our annihilation. U-953 maintained a steady northwesterly course across the vast plains of the Bay of Biscay. Strong fall gales whipped the surface and made the use of the schnorkel difficult. During the early hours of September 11th, just after we had passed the 8th longitude west, our centrifugal pump stopped working. The breakdown presented a grave danger, since it was the only pump capable of keeping us afloat in sudden emergencies. Berger, warrant officer and top mechanic, dismantled the pump and worked until dawn to put it back in service. Shortly after midnight on September 13th, the bad news from headquarters contained a personal shock. What I long had feared had finally happened. Darmstadt, my parents' new home, had been under heavy air attack. The raid during the previous night had wiped out the centre of the city. Tens of thousands had died, and many more thousands were left homeless. My parents, who had moved into the centre of town against my advice, had surely lost all their belongings once again, and I hesitated thinking any further. I hoped they had found protection in a public shelter nearby. The next day I set U-953 on a north-northwesterly course, continuing along the continental shelf. Our submerged voyage had been unmolested since we had sailed out of port. We owed our lives to the schnorkel just as surely as hundreds of U-boats owed their deaths to the lack of it. September 16th. 40 minutes after midnight, the starboard diesel stopped abruptly. The breakdowns began to haunt me. When the chief returned from the stern, his frown meant trouble. Diesel bushing busted. The hell with this old junk. Then a sudden vacuum prevented me from questioning him. The float of the schnorkel had jammed in closed position, and with the air intake cut off, the port engine had sucked most of the air out of the hull before the diesel could be halted. The chief's orders died in the thinned air. The men gasped for air, their eyes bulging. The chief lowered the boat, bringing the schnorkel head below surface in an effort to loosen the float. To no avail. Breathing became ever more difficult. Suffocation seemed imminent. The chief gesticulated wildly, trying to tell his men to lay down the air mast, which might result in unlocking the float. With agonizing effort, the mechanics turned handles, lowered the mast by cable, then erected it again with the primitive winch. Painful minutes passed, but then the mast drained and the seawater gargled down into the bilges. The float cleared with a snap, and air was sucked into the boat with a long sigh. The sudden change in pressure burst many an eardrum. Some of the men covered their faces in pain and sagged to the deck plates. Others swallowed violently to equalize the pressure. Bad luck and mechanical failures continued to dog the boat. On the night of September 17th, the sea was rough, and holding the boat at schnorkel depth with our one operative diesel was a nerve-wracking task. The chief had tried for hours to get the batteries fully charged, but his progress was retarded by the high seas and a continually jamming float. Then, without warning, the boat slipped out of the hands of my skilled engineer. The sound of gushing water emerged from the diesel compartment. The boat flipped away astern and sank at a severe down angle, totally out of control. The chief's frantic emergency measures finally caught her at 285 metres, and after a few wild curves, she was tamed. The reason for the water break was a puzzle, but somehow the air intake duct had allowed the ocean to enter the boat. There were well over 20 tons of water in the diesel room bilge, and 5 more in the duct. After the water had been drained, we again tried to schnorkel. But instead of air, tons of water again surged into the boat and forced her into another near-disastrous plunge. No doubt about it, our schnorkel was out of order, and the situation was desperate. Our only choice was to face suffocation below or destruction above. I chose the surface, where we had a slim chance to reach the Irish coast, hide in the cliffs and repair the damages. I swung the boat east and surfaced into a raging storm. The gunners raced to their automatics. 2 machinists loosened the deck grates and disappeared into the cavity between hull and superstructure to investigate the cause of our difficulties. The port diesel howled loudly. The boat began to run before hurricane winds and mountainous waves and driving cascades of rain. It was an abominable night, but one that would keep pursuers in port. Since the weather seemed to favour us, I extended the run for shore and fully charged the batteries. We dived just before dawn without interference. The chief reported the findings of his machinists. A ruptured blind flange at a T in the air intake system had been torn off its seat. A new flange would be fabricated and ready for installation by evening. Another violent night on surface, fit only for U-boats, protected us from harassment. Finally, after 2 hours of battling the elements, continually bathed in breakers, the 2 machinists had installed their new flange, and our batteries were fully charged. Without stretching our incredible luck any further, I dived U-953 into a 20-metre wave. At 23:18 the following night, we sighted the first beacon light of Ireland, which was burning in peacetime fashion. From the description of the exec at the scope, I identified it as Loophead, at the mouth of the Shannon River. 40 minutes after midnight, during a routine sound check, we heard detonating charges out at sea in the area we had crossed one night before. The British had returned to their hunting grounds. The machinists went to work dismantling and repairing the starboard diesel bushing, and we in the forward compartments concentrated on the task of keeping the boat on schnorkel depth. Short signals and news reached us during those hours of danger and apprehension. Headquarters repeatedly advised the few lone wolves to travel along the 200-metre line on their march to Norwegian ports. My observations of strong Allied defence activity along that line made me suspect that a leak in our security system had sent the British destroyers there first. A mere half-dozen boats were running the gauntlet of overwhelming Allied sea power, and all but 2 of them were doomed. A distress signal, repeated by headquarters, was handed to me in the control room. Bombed. Sinking. 62N01E, U867. Not much later, another distress signal came from the same area. Schnorkel defect. Air attack. Unable to dive. U865. This was the boat's final message. Before dawn, she was sunk by aircraft. Later that night, word came that Fortress Brest had fallen after 4 weeks of siege. My thoughts wandered back to Kapitän Winter, who must have done all he could, and then further east to Darmstadt. What was the fate of my family? I would have had an answer a year ago, when Dönitz still kept close contacts with his captains, informing them of good and bad news from home. But those days were gone beyond recall. A sudden cry came from the helmsman in the conning tower. "Can't hold course? Compass out of order?" I cursed in helpless rage at this latest breakdown. Without gyro compass, our mission was in dire jeopardy. The auxiliary magnetic compass was of no help. It had not been adjusted since the boat had left Kiel a year before, and was totally unreliable. Taking no chances, I ordered U-953 aground. Berger dismantled the gyro compass, repeatedly threatening that he had not the slightest notion how to put it together again. All day long the busy screws of Allied hunters cut the water around us. But finally, after 19 hours of ceaseless effort, Berger managed to fit the parts together. By dawn on September 20th, I had taken bearings from Inishbofin Lighthouse. Then, expecting enemy action soon, I discontinued schnorkeling and rode at periscope depth in search of the foe. ASDIC pings and propeller noises reached a hideous crescendo, but all I observed was one airplane and the cliffs of Clare Island. Then I realized that we had been fooled by a new British device. Floating sound buoys had been planted in coastal areas to drive lurking U-boats out to sea, where water conditions had no adverse effect upon the detection gears of British hunters gathered for the kill. Reassured by my discovery of the rattlers, I ordered normal speed. The following night the sea was calm and the rattlers were many. U-953 turned around Erris Head and proceeded toward Donegal Bay. At 0308 the port diesel stopped. A quick report from the rear. Diesel clutch jammed. I swore like a corsair, leaped forward and relieved the chief from the controls so he could investigate. He soon returned with disgusting news. The clutch was frozen solid. It had to be dismantled. With both diesels now out of order, I continued for another 3 hours on electric motors, then laid the boat aground in Sligo Bay. The machinists, thickly smeared with grease and oil, laboured frantically in the dwindling air for an entire day. Frequent booms of exploding charges at the western horizon and the fake pings and engine noises were our constant companions. The work on both diesels was finally completed 1 hour after midnight, and U-953 separated from the bottom. The hard rumble of detonating canisters followed us along the rocky coast. By early morning I spotted Arran Lighthouse sparkling in the sun, and at nightfall I took bearings from Tory Island, whose soaring cliffs rose like a cathedral from the ocean. During the night, U-953 entered the North Channel. It echoed with the British activity along the 200-metre line. We schnorkeled cautiously from beacon to beacon and reached Inishtrahool Island by dawn. U-953 had arrived in her hunting ground. It was 600, and I laid the boat in ambush on the rocky channel floor, preserving power for the attack. The thunder in the west never ceased. The Tommies dropped their costly canisters as if they were cheap marbles. The intensity of their barrage again led me to suspect that the British had been informed of our mission and had amassed great forces to catch up with my partners and myself. At one time, late in the evening, a destroyer passed within 2 miles, heading for Londonderry Harbour. Close to midnight I moved east, schnorkelling and penetrating deeper into the channel, where the convoys had but a narrow path to travel. For 3 hours we patrolled the narrows, cautiously manoeuvring, listening, probing. Then we settled again to the floor, 13 miles east of Inishtrahul. It seemed a perfect spot to hide and strike. Continuous underwater thunder rolling in from the west and weak propeller noises of fast-moving destroyers told us of fierce fighting seaward. None of the British captains, though, ever thought of searching the Narrows. They could have easily trapped us between the coast and the nearby minefields. During our third day in the Channel, 2 destroyers sped toward the Irish Sea. I ignored the killers in favour of bigger game, which was supposed to come along. A premature attack would only have disclosed our presence and closed the route to all shipping. That day and 2 more passed with plenty of activity along the 200-metre line, but no convoy cut through the Channel. On September 29th, after 7 days of fruitless search, the mission of ZJ 953 reached a sudden end. The schnorkel routine had become a nightmare. A wild storm drove high waves from the Atlantic toward the Irish coast. The chief worked frantically to hold the boat below surface, but at times the mast extended 3 and 4 metres into the air, allowing the Tommies to take proper aim. I saw no reason to continue the risk of getting bombed or wrecked in the cliffs, so I called off the torture. "That's enough for tonight, Chief. Bring her down." "Mast doesn't move," called the man activating the winch. "Cable is broke, sir. The damn thing is broken." The new breakdown was a deadly matter. If the boat assumed a sharp down angle, the mast would collapse, and no power could have erected it again. It would have meant the end of our submergence and of our existence. It was vividly and painfully clear that we were put out of action, and yet my luck still prevailed. The mast was stuck in an upright position, allowing us to make further use of the schnorkel, provided we could keep it erect. However, its bulky and conspicuous float, protruding above surface when on periscope depth, ruined all hope of launching a secret attack. The crippling damage to the schnorkel was the last straw in a long mission devoted to nothing but coping with our endless mechanical deficiencies. Although the crew deserved at least one victory as a reward for their endurance, I decided that I had to break off the patrol. With the schnorkel mast standing foolishly erect at a depth of 40 metres, I set U-953 on a course for our new home base, Bergen, Norway. We diagonally traversed the Channel, fighting a strong current, and steered between the minefields and the British killer groups toward the Outer Hebrides. Midnight, October 1st. The diesels pushed the boat forcefully ahead. Leaning over the chart table in the control room, I composed a signal informing Admiral U-boats of our mishap and planned a quick escape from the point of transmission. At 0100, our message flashed from the antenna mounted to the tip of the schnorkel. It took only 4 letters in code to say, "No enemy traffic. Strong defence. Damages. Return to base. U-953. My communication prompted headquarters to request other boats in the area to report their findings. But the call was not heard by our 3 companion boats on the North Channel mission. U-484 and U-743 had been destroyed northwest of Inishtrahul on the same day, less than 20 miles apart, and 7th had been sunk off the Irish coast. My signal produced other obnoxious results. At daybreak, our sound gear detected 3 destroyers approaching from astern. I swore to myself never again to use the radio transmitter and to leave the guesswork up to the fellows at headquarters. At 10:30, a new hunter-killer group was picked up by our gear, this time port ahead. We counted 6 destroyers screening the sea, and they probably had squadrons of aircraft supporting their search. The pinging and throbbing din soon filled all compartments. Some men listened with wide-open eyes, while others turned in their bunks, pretending not to hear a thing. The 6 Tommies searched and probed, unaware that we were but 3 miles to their east and only 20 metres below surface, sailing along the outer edge of their minefield. By nightfall, the noise had wandered gradually astern and out to sea. At midnight, there was but a hint of sound in the gear. 2 hours later, the spook had disappeared, and at 0300 we breathed fresh air and resumed our noisy routine. For several nights and days, U-953 travelled past the Outer Hebrides and into the northern regions. Here, strong fall gales whipped the surface and threatened to break our precarious lifeline. Constantly hunted by destroyers, constantly shadowed by countless aircraft, U-953 somehow remained immune. During these weeks of perpetual submergence, the men lived with their shattered eardrums, their impaired eyesight, their abused lungs, and, worst of all, their private thoughts. One could think of youth, school, the glorious early advances on land, our hundreds of sinkings and victory celebrations, women and love. But once the plug of memory was pulled, a bitter fountain rose to mind. Our lost battles, our defeats at sea, flights out of ports, memories of friends now dead on the bottom, retreats on land, disintegrating cities, and above all for me, the uncertain fate of my parents and sister. While U-953, floating on her eastbound course, furtively passed the Shetland Islands in the second week of October 1944, the obliteration of our U-boat force was nearing completion. Since we had escaped beleaguered La Rochelle, 17 U-boats, almost the entire contingent at sea, had been destroyed. All but 4 of these boats had sailed from Norway on their first patrol. They were perfectly equipped with the schnorkel. Their crews were well trained, but badly prepared and ill-advised. They had become easy kills for the Allies. 40 miles northeast of the Shetland Islands, we ran into a killer group which had sealed off the Norwegian Sea. Then came 28 hours of cruel pursuit, nerve-wracking pings, chasing screws, circling destroyers, detonating depth charges. In the throes of this last ordeal, we floated just below surface, prepared every minute to shoot and die, and yet U-953 managed once again to slip out of the devil's grip. For many hours after the ordeal, the sound of hell followed in our wake until, after 6 weeks of unprecedented submersion, the soaring mountains of Norway stopped us from sailing further east. Some 2 hours after daybreak, I spotted the planes on duty, and also the low lighthouse on a forlorn rock in the middle of the passage into Bonyafjord. The sea broke on the naked stone, creating a foamy circle around the tiny island. Trusting the mast no longer, I changed to electric drive. 17-955 worked hard to overpower the current and gain a position from where we could surge into the fjord. The iron drum shook under the broadside attack of the sea. A sudden thud, then a rumble and a bang. The mast had fallen on deck. The force of the rising tide threatened to drive the boat into the outer cliffs. U-953 thrust forward at 10 knots, all she could produce submerged, fighting like a salmon against the turbulence. Metre by metre she crept ahead. As she floated past the lighthouse, she was caught in the violent whirlpool and forced toward a mountain wall that rose perpendicular from the water's edge. I made a quick adjustment, and the boat was pushed into the fjord. And yet again we had survived. A trawler, a Coast Guard vessel, lay quietly in the centre of the fjord, oblivious to our submerged arrival. When I was able to see the faces of her crew clearly, I lowered the scope to make the surprise complete. My command to surface ended the long submergence. Compressed air hissed through the pipes. With a low moan, the boat rose into daylight and into a broadside of gun muzzles. The startled captain shouted through his megaphone, "What the devil are you doing?" Pleased by the success of my little trick, I shouted back, "This is a raiding party. Do you have contraband aboard?" "No, just a harem, but not for your boys." And, as if he were indeed afraid we would have a closer look at his ship, the captain ordered his vessel onto opposite course. Meanwhile, all my men poured out of the bridge hatch. Some manned the guns, others brought ammunition to the platforms, and the rest swung through the railing on deck, putting white cigarettes into their pale faces. After breathing the fresh sea breeze for some time, I choked on the beastly stench of rot and decay which escaped the hatch. The aromatic scent of tobacco, missed for so long, did not disguise the horrible smell of 6 weeks of slow decomposition. On the contrary, the first cigarettes left a bitter taste in my mouth. But 2 hours later, as U-953 turned the Bergenfjord, I had rediscovered their old spicy savour. The Coast Guard vessel had signalled our arrival in advance, promoting a meagre reception. A handful of men in blues or grey leather suits had come down to the waterfront. It was a rare opportunity for them to witness a U-boat's return from patrol. For months boats had sailed, but none had returned. However, my men hardly fit the heroic role in which we were cast. We had filthy hair, long beards, green faces, hollow cheeks, and eyes as big as golf balls. We looked more like undernourished and fatigued jungle fighters. Our lines were thrown ashore. The commanding officer stalked aboard, nodded at my brief report, hailed the crew for their accomplishments, told us that greater sacrifices were expected, but warmly assured us that the worst lay behind and that things would improve fundamentally almost at once. He then invited us for cocktails and dinner. The drinks were strong and the food was heavy. We were asked about our last days in Brest and our stopover in La Rochelle, and the crew responded with tales as fantastic as the 1001 Nights. When it appeared that my men had had too much liquor to stop their yarns, I rose from the table and ended the party. We were billeted in a building of our own. Soon one could hear the bearded seafarers singing loud chantés in tubs and showers. After a good night's sleep, I launched a campaign to acquire a new boat, for U-953 was virtually disintegrating. She not only required a new schnorkel system, but also 2 new diesels, a whole new complement of batteries, and 1,000 other pieces of equipment not readily available. My conference with the flotilla's chief engineer went in the right direction. There was not a single part that I needed in the base, nor were there facilities to put my boat into dry dock for a long, exhaustive overhaul. I seemed to have won my case. More was missing in Bergen than parts and replacements. There was no mail waiting. I had expected a letter, a telegram, anything to tell me that all was well at home. But our mailbags had been lost somewhere, either in the gigantic rerouting snarl in France or in supply vessels sunk by enemy aircraft in the Skagerrak and in the fjords. We were cut off from the homeland, and uncertainty over the fate of our loved ones rested heavily upon every man's mind. Through grey layers of thin, low clouds, I sailed U-953 into the arsenal to unload our torpedoes. There we saw a few dilapidated hulls in the process of being cut up for scrap. I had expected revived U-boat activity in Norwegian ports after the bases in France had been lost, and the quiet was depressing. I searched in vain for new type U-boats which we had long been promised. In the compound, evening dinner was very small and exactly apportioned, a fair index to our fortunes in the 5th year of war. I was informed that the commandant had arranged a party in our honour. There would be drinks and snacks, music, and some Norwegian girls to dance with. Returning to my room, I retrieved my blues from the lone suitcase I had brought with me. The suit was clammy and full of wrinkles and rank with mould. The odour accompanied me as I was driven to a lodge in the mountains, the flotilla's resort. In the morning of my 3rd day on land, I met an old acquaintance, Senior Officer U-Boats West. Captain Rosing had succeeded in escaping his La Rochelle quarters by plane only hours before the Americans moved in. He had already established offices near the compound for a renewed campaign against England. After briefing him on my patrol, I made my plea. "Sir, I appeal to you for a new boat, one of the new types if possible. U-953 is simply falling apart. There are no facilities in Norway to repair and put her into fighting condition." "I see no opportunity for you to take over a new boat at this time," replied the senior. "As a matter of fact, we are making special efforts to restore every conventional type U-boat for a massive offensive in spring. Sir, rehabilitating our boat may take as long as building a new one. That is not for you to determine. We are making the decisions. You will get the orders." That was clear enough, and also the end of our conversation. I was dismissed. The decision to reconstruct U-953 in a German shipyard was reached the same day. My future was inseparably intertwined with that of U-953, and I realised that I had better stop dreaming of a perfect new boat and concentrate on extending the old one's life. The order to rebuild the boat completely was received by the crew with stoicism. There was other news pouring in over the radio which aroused far more concern. The British, we learned, had reached the Lower Rhine, and the Americans had penetrated the first German city, Aachen. There were reports that Stuttgart, Munich, and even Innsbruck had been the targets of huge Allied bomber fleets. The situation was very serious, but, we were told, it was not hopeless. The voice from Berlin assured us over and over again that new weapons would soon strike and final victory would then be ours. We believed, we trusted, and we continued to sail. At dusk, on a misty day late in October, U-953 was ready to leave port. A small Coast Guard cutter guided us into the fjord just before nightfall. It was a silent march through unfriendly waters in which British torpedo boats were already operating. At the end of the first night, we sailed into Haugesund harbour, hid the boat behind a pier-end shed for the day. By nightfall, we followed our escort through the cliffs, rapids and narrows along the rocky coast to Stavanger. Another strained day at an utterly unprotected pier. At sundown, we started a night-long run through fjords and dangerously narrow waterways to Egersund. Here we fastened our lines to the crippled pines growing out of the cracks of a huge rock and pulled our boat under the branches. Next night, we raced alone into the open sea, and using the cable temporarily repaired in Bergen, schnorkeled our way around the southern heel of Norway into the Skagerrak. 2 nights later, we met a German convoy in the Baltic and sailed around Kiel lightship just before daybreak. It was a grey, cold morning when U-953 came to rest alongside the Tirpitz pier. We were in Germany at last. Our arrival caused no celebration. In fact, it went entirely unnoticed. Dressed in my old wrinkled leather suit, I stretched my legs on the pier and walked over to the old steamer, which had been moored there since the war began. I searched for the 5th U-boat flotilla's offices, for the tender Lesch had disappeared. I was told that they had been relocated ashore. Stalking over the familiar tarred planks, I saw evidence of great decay since my last visit 22 months ago. An old tender lay aground, bombed to wreckage, her decks spilled over by heavy oil and scummy water. In the distance stood the blackened walls of demolished houses. The hills of rubble and steel that dotted the shore had once been the elegant Bellevue district. I eventually found the flotilla's new quarters among destroyed barracks, and the commanding officer accepted my report with indifference. I was advised to sail to Lübeck. Here the overhaul of my boat could be guaranteed, whereas a stay in Kiel would only jeopardize her existence. 1 hour after we had fastened our lines, we removed them again. U-953 scurried out of Kiel harbour and chased eastward under the evening sky. When the morning fog lifted, U-953 steered into the mouth of the Trave River, and shortly before noon came to rest at a flimsy pier of the small naval base Lübeck Seams. My attempt to report my arrival to the commanding officer met closed doors. A guard advised me that the commandant had gone for lunch and that it might be hours before he would return. There was no activity in the small compound, and it seemed that the Navy had made little use of the facilities. U-953 was the only boat at the pier. The men sat on the rim of the bridge or squatted on deck enjoying their lunch. It was little enough, but we all felt grateful. At mid-afternoon I was told that the commandant was inclined to receive us. We assembled in the small square at the base, and I presented the crew to the well-fed officer. It mattered little to me that he had found a perfect place to serve the country, preserving his habits and family life. But I bitterly resented the look of distaste that crossed his face as he inspected my seafarers, unkempt and exhausted after months and years of frontline service. Our rehabilitation began at once. I sailed U-953 into the shipyard, where she was to remain for her own rejuvenation. Returning to the compound, I noted with satisfaction that the exec had taken possession of a barracks and was about to settle the men in their places. My suitcase had been delivered into a corner room, which was to be my home for some time. I unpacked and sent my few clothes to the laundry and cleaner. Then, finally, nervously, I tried to get in touch with my parents. But telephone service to Darmstadt was still out of order, this 2 months after the air raid. I sent a telegram instead, asking them to reply at once by wire. It was soon made known that the overhaul of U-953 would take 8 to 10 weeks. The news, which meant a longer furlough for all hands, came as a godsend to the men, whose desire to rush home and search for their loved ones had grown ever more desperate since we landed in Norway. Since my parents had not answered my urgent telegram, I arranged for my own departure somewhat earlier than I had planned. I was about to leave the compound when headquarters informed me that it was necessary to transfer my chief engineer and my executive officer. The loss of the chief, an outstanding technician, was a great disappointment, and it became a serious blow when his replacement turned out to be my inept former chief aboard U-415. To make matters worse, I was also presented with a very young ensign who knew nothing of U-boats. Since he was to assume the second officer's place, I had to raise the incumbent, Zimmer, to executive, even though he lacked the experience to fill this position. The dangerous shuffle of personnel demanded strong action, but I decided to do nothing until my return from leave. It was a cold, misty day in early November when I departed from Lübeck and headed for Darmstadt by way of Berlin. The express was packed with people who spoke with a hard Baltic accent, people who had fled their homes ahead of the advancing Russians. The refugees, mostly women and children and old folks, wore threadbare clothes and carried humble housewares. They stood in trembling groups beside their boxes, bundles, valises, and bedding. Along this pitiful human chain, alarming war news and rumours flashed through the train from compartment to compartment. The Eastern Front was moving west fast, and Königsberg was in gravest danger, and the Western Front was moving east almost as fast. I leaned at the window in the passageway, deep in forlorn thoughts. At my feet lay the suitcase with the presents for my parents and Trudy. The landscape rushed by, desolate and grey. In time, the monotonous North German plains were broken more and more often by larger and larger clusters of blackened walls, craters, rubble, and cut-off chimneys. Then the ruins themselves became a vast plain of destroyed city blocks, a whole civilization in ruins. We had arrived in Berlin. People on the move, people in flight. Thousands filled the station. Women in Red Cross uniforms distributed food and a black gravy they said was coffee. Thin young infantrymen, heavily burdened with guns and knapsacks, wearing faded and patched uniforms, moved about like worn old men. I shoved my luggage through the crowded platforms and headed crosstown for the Anhalter station. The subway ride spared me the sight of the ruins above, but not the human ruins below. The thousands of homeless who lived in the underground, the hollow-cheeked women and children on the run, the bewildered soldiers on their way to shattered homes or battered fronts. Privation, hunger, and lack of sleep, indifference and resignation marked the faces. Night had fallen over the city when my darkened train left behind the devastated world of Berlin and shrieked and clanked its way south. I passed the hours smoking, waiting, dreaming. I calculated that I would be home, if not in Darmstadt, then at father's new plant, by noon the following day, provided all went well. 1 hour after midnight, a girl in the uniform of the Luftwaffe's Woman Corps had taken an opposite seat in the compartment and was showing a more than casual interest in me. To escape her annoying curiosity, I stepped into the corridor and lighted a cigarette, but moments later the girl followed. She asked hesitantly, "Aren't you Trudy's brother?" Involuntarily I said, "No, young lady, you must be mistaken." "I'm sorry," she said, "but you look just like him. You see, my girlfriend's brother is also in the Navy, and the resemblance is striking." At this I confessed, "All right, I am Trudy's brother. And who are you?" She began to smile. Her memory had not tricked her. Don't you recognize me at all? I am Clara Ihinger. I was a classmate of Trudy, maybe her best friend. No, I did not recognize this woman, but I remembered her as a little girl when I was a boy of 15. 10 years, a whole lifetime, had passed since then. Now that she was here, I welcomed the opportunity to shorten my trip with pleasant memories of our happy youth. We talked about our years in school and recalled long-forgotten episodes. She had indeed been my sister's best friend when we had lived near Lake Constance. Then Clara told me that she had always liked my parents, that the long article about them in the local paper had been so well written. A sudden chill clutched my throat, and I demanded, "What article are you talking about?" Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in horror. "Don't you know?" she stumbled. "No, you didn't know." She covered her face with both hands. She did not have to tell me any more. Everything around me began to turn, very slowly at first, then with a rush, as if a giant wheel had gone out of control. I heard the girl sobbing and saying far away, "Oh, forgive me. Poor Trudy and your parents died in the air raid on Darmstadt 2 months ago." In my sickening dizziness, I pressed myself against the glass wall of the compartment to stay erect. The window, the wall, the people faded before my eyes. I clenched my teeth fiercely and fought back my tears. No one should ever see me crying. I closed my eyes and drew a deep, racking breath.